Before you skip this video, ask yourself one question. What if the worst day of your life was actually the beginning of your greatest blessing? After losing her husband, a pregnant widow was thrown out with nothing but a rusted key and a forgotten inheritance everyone believed was worthless. But hidden behind the walls of an abandoned manor was a secret, and a hidden treasure so powerful that it changed countless lives forever. Don't leave now, because the shocking discovery and emotional ending may completely change how you see loss, hope, and second chances. She was only 25 years old, dressed in a faded black morning gown, whose sleeves had been mended so many times that the stitches showed brighter than the cloth itself. In one trembling hand, she clutched a rusted iron key wrapped in yellowing paper. In the other, a handkerchief held exactly 12 shillings, every penny she possessed in the world. And beneath her weary heart, another heart was beating. No one knew. Not her late husband's proud family. Not the cold-faced solicitor who hurried through the reading of the will. Not even the young widow herself until 3 days after the funeral, when an elderly village midwife quietly took her hand, looked into her tear-filled eyes, and whispered the words that would change everything. "Mrs. Bennet, you're going to have a baby." For one impossible moment, Eleanor Bennet forgot how to breathe. The child she had prayed for during 18 months of marriage. The child her beloved husband, Nathan, had dreamed of holding. Would never know his father's voice. She wanted to collapse. She wanted to scream. Instead, she smiled through tears, laid a trembling hand across her stomach, and made a promise no one else would ever hear. "Whatever happens to us, I will keep you safe." She had no idea that within a single week, that promise would be tested in ways no mother could ever imagine. Because before the sun set on the following Friday, Eleanor would lose not only her husband, she would lose her home, her family, her place in society, and nearly her unborn child. The Bennet family estate had always looked magnificent from the outside white stone walls, polished windows, sprawling gardens where roses bloomed even in early spring. But grief has a way of stripping beauty from a place, revealing what had always lived beneath. The day Nathan was buried, kindness was buried with him. His mother never embraced Eleanor. His 2 older sisters avoided looking at her altogether. The servants, once polite, now lowered their eyes as if she had already become a stranger walking through rooms where she no longer belonged. Every conversation stopped when she entered. Every door seemed to close a little faster. Every meal became quieter, until silence itself felt like another form of cruelty. Nathan had loved her despite everything. She had been born to a carpenter and a seamstress in the small riverside village of Ashcombe. She brought no fortune into the marriage, no famous surname, no influential relatives. Only gentle hands, fierce determination, and a heart that never stopped giving. Nathan used to tell her those were the richest gifts anyone could possess. His family disagreed. To them, she had always been the mistake he should never have made. Now that he was gone, they intended to erase her as though she had never existed. Only one person still remembered a dying man's final wish. Old Mr. Aldridge, the family solicitor. Nathan had gripped his father's hand during his final hours and spoken words that haunted everyone in the room. "Promise me, Eleanor will never be left alone." His father had promised. 6 weeks later, he too was dead. Promises, Eleanor would soon discover, become remarkably fragile when the people who made them are no longer alive to defend them. The reading of the will lasted nearly an hour. Properties, investments, jewelry, fine horses, silver collections. Everything passed neatly into the hands of Nathan's mother and daughters. Eleanor sat silently near the doorway, unnoticed, almost invisible, until the solicitor reached the final page. "There remains one additional inheritance." The room fell still. a neglected stone manor located near Blackthorn Hollow, together with its surrounding grounds, to be transferred entirely to Mrs. Eleanor Bennet. A long silence followed. Then came laughter. Not loud, not joyful. The kind of laughter meant to wound. Nathan's eldest sister smiled coldly. "How fitting," the younger one added. "A collapsing house for a woman whose future has already collapsed." Even Nathan's mother barely looked up. "Take it," she said flatly. "Perhaps the roof will fall before winter and spare everyone the inconvenience." No one noticed Eleanor instinctively protecting her stomach beneath folded hands. No one imagined the child growing there might one day become the true heir they had been so eager to cast aside. No one bothered to visit that forgotten manor. No one wondered why Nathan's father had insisted she receive it. No one questioned why the house had remained locked for more than 30 years. Because sometimes, the greatest fortunes in this world are dismissed by those too blinded by pride to look beyond the dust, and hidden behind one forgotten library wall, waited a secret so astonishing that before this story is over, every cruel word spoken in that grand drawing room would return to haunt the people who had laughed the hardest. The following morning, Eleanor awoke before dawn. For a long moment, she lay perfectly still, listening to the silence that filled the grand house. Somewhere below, a clock chimed 5 slow notes. The servants had not yet begun their work, and the halls that had once echoed with Nathan's laughter now felt colder than a churchyard in winter. She rested a hand over her stomach. The child was still too small for movement, but somehow she could already feel a quiet presence, a reason to rise when every part of her wished to remain hidden beneath the blankets forever. "We're all each other has now," she whispered. That promise steadied her. By mid-morning, a maid she had never spoken more than a few words to knocked softly on her door. "Mrs. Bennet, the solicitor is waiting in the drawing room." Eleanor smoothed the wrinkles from her mourning dress and descended the staircase one careful step at a time. Every polished banister, every portrait on the wall, every familiar corner reminded her of Nathan. It was impossible to believe that only a fortnight earlier they had walked these same corridors together, speaking of planting roses in the spring and filling the nursery with sunlight. Now she walked alone. The drawing room was already full. Mrs. Bennet sat rigidly in the late master's chair, her posture as sharp as cut glass. Victoria and Beatrice occupied either side of her, dressed in expensive black silk that somehow carried no sign of grief. Mr. Aldridge, the solicitor, stood by the fireplace with a leather case tucked beneath one arm. His eyes softened when Eleanor entered. She suspected he was the only person in the room who pitied her. The formal reading of the estate had ended the day before, but there remained documents requiring signatures before the transfer of property could be completed. Mr. Aldridge cleared his throat. "There are merely a few final papers, Mrs. Bennet." He slid several pages across the polished table. Victoria smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "We've made everything quite simple for you." Eleanor lowered her eyes to the document. The first page seemed ordinary enough. The second made her heart stop. She read it again, then a third time. It was a legal declaration stating that she voluntarily relinquished any future claim not only to the family estate, but also to any inheritance that might arise through herself or any direct descendants. Her fingers tightened around the paper. Something was terribly wrong. She looked up. "I don't understand." Mrs. Bennet folded her hands calmly. "You needn't concern yourself with legal language." "It's only a formality," Beatrice added sweetly. "You'll have the old manor. We simply wish to avoid future misunderstandings." Future misunderstandings. The words echoed strangely, almost instinctively. Eleanor placed one hand over her stomach beneath the folds of her dress. The movement was small, barely noticeable, but she did not miss the way Mr. Aldridge's eyes followed it. For the briefest instant, concern crossed his face. Then it was gone. He opened his mouth as though intending to speak. Before Mrs. Bennet interrupted. "You'll sign today." It wasn't a request. It was an order. Eleanor looked once more at the paper. Nathan had always encouraged her to read every document before placing her name upon it. "Ink has a longer memory than people," he used to say with a smile. She could almost hear his voice now. Slowly, she laid the pen back onto the table. "I'm sorry." The room stiffened. "I cannot sign something I do not fully understand." Silence. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Victoria let out a short laugh. "I told you she would become troublesome." Mrs. Bennet rose from her chair. For the first time since Nathan's funeral, she looked directly into Eleanor's eyes. There was no sorrow there. Only calculation. "You should remember where you came from," she said quietly. "My son gave you a respectable name. My husband gave you shelter. And now we are giving you a house no one else would accept." She stepped closer. "You would be wise not to ask for more." Eleanor felt tears threatening, but she refused to let them fall. "Not here. Not before people who mistook kindness for weakness. I've asked for nothing." "No," Mrs. Bennet replied coldly. "You merely existed long enough to become inconvenient." Those words struck harder than any slap. For one heartbeat, Eleanor thought she might break. Then she remembered the tiny life depending on her. She lifted her chin. "I'll keep the manor. I'll sign only the papers that belong to it. And nothing else." The room fell into stunned silence. Mr. Aldridge slowly gathered the unsigned document and slipped it back into his leather case without another word. Something in his expression suggested relief. As Eleanor turned toward the door, she heard Victoria mutter under her breath, "She'll come crawling back before the first snowfall." No one answered. No one knew. Not one of them realized that the forgotten manor they mocked would soon become the safest place in England for a mother protecting the greatest secret she carried. And waiting behind its weathered stone walls, fate had already begun preparing an answer to every cruelty spoken in that room. Eleanor left the Bennet estate before sunrise 2 days later. No one came to say goodbye. No servant hurried after her with forgotten belongings. No member of the family offered a blessing for the difficult road ahead. Even the grand front door, once opened each morning with practiced ceremony, closed behind her with a hollow thud that sounded less like a farewell and more like the final page of a life that no longer belonged to her. Her entire world fit inside one weathered trunk. A second black mourning dress, a small leather-bound household journal her grandmother had left her, a silver locket containing Nathan's miniature portrait, the rusted iron key wrapped in brown paper, and 12 lonely shillings tied carefully into the corner of a linen handkerchief. Nothing more. As the coach pulled away, Eleanor looked back only once, not because she hoped someone would come running after her, but because Nathan was buried beneath the old oak tree beyond the chapel. She pressed 2 trembling fingers against the window. "Goodbye, my love." The words never reached her lips. They stayed locked inside her heart. The journey west seemed endless. Rain followed the coach for nearly 2 days, turning the narrow country roads into rivers of mud. Every jolt of the wheels sent sharp pain through Eleanor's back, and more than once she wrapped both arms around herself, frightened less for her own comfort than for the tiny life she carried. Morning sickness came without warning. At the first coaching inn, she slipped quietly behind the stable to steady herself against a wooden fence before anyone could notice. An elderly stablewoman found her there. "You've lost someone," the woman said gently. Eleanor nodded. "And something tells me," the stranger continued after studying her pale face, "you've still got someone depending on you." Eleanor's breath caught. She stared in silence. The old woman smiled with the knowing kindness that only age can bring. I've delivered enough babies to recognize hope hiding beneath grief. Without another question, she pressed a small packet of dried peppermint leaves into Eleanor's hand. For the sickness. Eleanor tried to pay. The woman closed her fingers over the coins. No. Then she added softly, one day, when another frightened woman crosses your path, help her instead. Eleanor tucked the herbs safely into her pocket. Years later, she would remember that moment far more vividly than the expensive dinners she had once eaten in the Bennett dining room. Because true kindness rarely announces itself. It simply appears when the soul needs it most. By the third afternoon, the coach could travel no farther. The driver climbed down, surveyed the washed-out road ahead, and shook his head. I'm afraid this is as close as we can get. He pointed toward a narrow lane disappearing into rolling hills. Blackthorn Hollow lies about a mile beyond. Eleanor thanked him quietly. The coach disappeared in a cloud of mist, leaving her utterly alone. The wind carried the scent of rain and distant pine. She looked at the enormous trunk resting in the mud beside her. She tried lifting it. It barely moved. For the first time since Nathan's death, fear overwhelmed her. Not elegant sorrow. Not quiet grief. Raw fear. She was 25. Pregnant. Alone? Standing on an unfamiliar road with almost no money and no one expecting her arrival. She sank onto the trunk and lowered her head into trembling hands. What am I going to do? She whispered. Her voice vanished into the wind. Then, a small voice answered. Looks like you could use a friend. Eleanor looked up. A boy no older than 13 stood a short distance away beside a shaggy gray mule. His boots were patched. His coat hung loosely from narrow shoulders. Freckles covered a face that wore an easy smile despite the cold drizzle. I can carry your trunk, he offered. I don't have much to pay. He shrugged. My mom says people don't always need paying. Before Eleanor could protest, the boy had already lifted one side of the trunk with surprising strength and secured it across the mule's back. As they walked together along the winding lane, he chatted cheerfully about the village below, the old mill by the creek, and the abandoned manor that everyone believed was haunted. My friends won't even go near it, he laughed. They say strange lights shine from the windows at night. Eleanor smiled faintly. I suppose I'll have to find out for myself. The boy glanced at her. I don't think ghosts are what people should fear. Well, what should they fear? He thought for a moment. Loneliness. The answer struck Eleanor so deeply that she could not speak. Because for the first time, someone had unknowingly spoken the truth she had been carrying since Nathan's funeral. They rounded the final bend just as the clouds began to part. And there it stood. The manor. Its stone walls were cracked. Its slate roof sagged beneath years of neglect. Ivy climbed across shuttered windows like silent hands refusing to let go. One chimney leaned dangerously toward the sky. The garden had long ago surrendered to wild grass and tangled roses. It looked less like a home, and more like a forgotten memory waiting to disappear. The village had abandoned it. The Bennett family had mocked it. Everyone believed it was worthless. But as Eleanor rested one hand upon the child beneath her heart, an unexpected feeling washed over her. Not despair, not disappointment, hope. Because unlike the people she had left behind, the old house did not judge her. It did not ask about her birth. It did not care that she had no fortune. It simply stood there, waiting for someone willing to believe that even the most broken places and the most broken hearts could still become home again. Eleanor stood on the weathered stone porch for what felt like an eternity. The old iron key rested cold in her palm, its rust rough against her fingers. Before her loomed the manor that everyone had mocked, a house dismissed as a burden, a joke, a final insult disguised as an inheritance. The afternoon wind sighed through the overgrown hedges, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and forgotten seasons. For a fleeting moment, doubt crept into her heart. What if they were right? She wondered. What if this house truly is nothing more than another way for them to watch me fail? She closed her eyes. The cruel laughter from the drawing room echoed once more in her memory. A collapsing house for a woman whose future has already collapsed. Those words had followed her every mile of the journey. But then, a tiny flutter, so soft she almost mistook it for the wind. Her hand instinctively rested against her stomach. The village midwife had warned her it was still too early to feel the baby move. Perhaps it was only her imagination. Or perhaps it was hope refusing to die. A single tear slipped down her cheek. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the child. "I'm frightened." Her voice broke. "I don't know how to be both your mother and your father." Silence answered her. Yet somehow, in that silence, she no longer felt completely alone. Taking a slow breath, Eleanor slid the iron key into the ancient lock. It resisted at first, as though the house itself had forgotten what it meant to welcome someone home. Then, with a deep metallic groan, the mechanism surrendered. The heavy oak door swung inward. A wave of cool air rolled out to meet her. The scent of old timber, stone, dust, and faded memories filled the entrance hall. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the shutters, sending thin golden ribbons across the worn flagstone floor. Everything was still, not abandoned, not lifeless. Simply waiting. She stepped inside. Each footstep echoed softly through the empty corridors, as though the house were awakening after a very long sleep. The staircase leaned slightly with age, yet remained sturdy. The carved banister, though coated in years of dust, still displayed the careful craftsmanship of hands long gone. The fireplace in the entrance hall was black with soot, but its stone mantel remained beautifully carved with climbing ivy and tiny woodland birds. Eleanor smiled despite herself. Someone had once loved this place. Not as an investment, not as a symbol of status, but as a home. She wandered slowly from room to room. The kitchen still held rows of copper hooks waiting for pots that had long since disappeared. A faded blue teacup rested quietly beside the cracked sink, as though someone had intended to return after finishing an ordinary afternoon. An old rocking chair stood near a window overlooking the garden. One arm was worn smooth by countless years of gentle hands. Eleanor reached out and touched it. How many mothers had rocked restless babies here? How many bedtime stories had been whispered beside this very window? For the first time since Nathan died, she didn't imagine what she had lost. She imagined what she might still have. A nursery, a warm kitchen, fresh bread cooling on the windowsill, tiny footsteps racing down the hallway, laughter filling rooms that had forgotten how to echo with joy. The vision disappeared almost as quickly as it came. But it had been enough. She no longer saw ruins. She saw possibilities. Mrs. Harper, her beloved grandmother, had once told her something she never forgot. A house doesn't become empty because people leave it. Eleanor, it becomes empty when no one loves it anymore. Standing in the middle of the dusty entrance hall, Eleanor slowly turned in a full circle. The wallpaper was peeling. Rain had stained part of the ceiling. Several windows would need replacing before winter. The roof undoubtedly leaked. There was more work than one woman could finish in a year. Yet strangely, the burden no longer frightened her. Every cracked stone looked repairable. Every broken chair could be mended. Every neglected room seemed to whisper, "Give me another chance." She understood then that the manor and her own life were far more alike than she had realized. Both had been judged by appearances. Both had been abandoned by people who should have cared. Both carried hidden scars no stranger could see. And both still possessed a heart strong enough to begin again. As evening settled over Blackthorn Hollow, Eleanor opened the shutters of the front room one by one. Golden light spilled across the floor for the first time in decades. Outside, villagers walking home slowed their steps. Some paused. Others removed their hats in quiet surprise. Smoke did not yet rise from the chimney. No flowers bloomed in the tangled garden. The house remained old. The walls remained cracked. But one unmistakable truth had already begun to spread through the village. After 30 years of silence, someone had finally come home. And neither Eleanor nor the people watching from the lane could have imagined that, hidden somewhere within those ancient walls. Fate had preserved a miracle that would soon transform not only her future, but the future of every soul who crossed the threshold of Blackthorn Manor. The first night inside Blackthorn Manor was colder than Eleanor had imagined. The wind slipped through cracked window frames like whispered voices, and every groan of the old timbers reminded her that the house had spent decades standing alone against rain, snow, and time itself. She spread her wool cloak across an old four-poster bed whose faded quilt was still remarkably intact beneath years of dust. Sleep, however, refused to come. Instead, she lay awake with one hand resting over the gentle curve of her stomach. Outside, branches scraped softly against the walls. Inside, silence wrapped itself around her like another blanket. "You're safe," she whispered to the tiny life growing inside her. "We may have lost everything else, but tonight, at least, we have a roof over our heads." It was not a grand promise, but it was enough. At first light, Eleanor tied her sleeves back with a strip of ribbon and opened every shutter she could reach. The morning sun poured into the manor for the first time in more than 30 years. Dust floated through the golden light like thousands of tiny stars. She smiled. It felt almost as if the old house were taking its first breath. Mrs. Harper had once taught her, "Never begin by mourning what is broken. Begin by discovering what still works." So that became her plan. She did not count the cracked walls. She counted the strong ones. She did not grieve over broken furniture. She searched for pieces that could still be repaired. Every room became a quiet conversation between despair and possibility. By noon, her hands were blistered. By evening, her black dress had turned gray with dust. Still, she kept going. Not because she was fearless, because someone else depended on her courage. 3 days passed. The villagers watched from a distance. Each morning they noticed another shutter standing open. "Another window cleaned?" Another chimney cleared of tangled nests. Smoke finally curled into the autumn sky. Children began pointing toward the manor. "The haunted house has a fire." Old women smiled knowingly. Perhaps the house had never been haunted after all. Perhaps it had simply been lonely. On the 4th morning, there came a gentle knock at the front door. Eleanor wiped flour from her hands and opened it. Standing on the porch was the same freckled boy who had carried her trunk from the crossroads. Behind him stood his mother, a widow named Clara Dawson. She held a small basket covered with embroidered linen. "I hope we're not disturbing you," Clara said shyly. "My son wouldn't stop talking about the young lady who moved into the manor." The boy grinned. "I told Mum ghosts don't bake bread." Eleanor laughed. It was the first genuine laugh that had escaped her lips since Nathan died. Clara lifted the cloth from the basket. "Fresh bread, a crock of butter, 6 brown eggs. I'm afraid it isn't much." To Eleanor, it looked like abundance. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. "I don't have enough money to—" Clara interrupted gently. "You don't owe us anything." She looked around the entrance hall. "My husband always said this house deserved another chance." Then she smiled. "So do the people who live in it?" When they left, Eleanor stood quietly in the doorway, holding the warm loaf against her chest. she realized something extraordinary. The first gift she had received in Blackthorn Hollow had not been gold. It had been kindness. As the weeks passed, that kindness multiplied. A carpenter named Mr. Rowan stopped by after hearing the roof leaked in the western wing. "I've some spare oak beams. You can pay me when you can." An elderly mason offered leftover stone from another project. A shepherd appeared with wool blankets before the first frost. A gardener quietly planted winter vegetables in the neglected kitchen garden without asking permission. Each person gave only a little. Together, they gave Eleanor hope. One rainy afternoon, while scrubbing shelves in what had once been the library, Eleanor became dizzy. The room spun. She caught herself against a heavy oak table before collapsing. For several terrifying moments, she couldn't breathe. Her hands instinctively covered her stomach. "No, not now. Please, not now." A sharp pain crossed her abdomen. Fear, unlike anything she had ever known, flooded through her. She staggered towards the front door just as Clara Dawson happened to be walking up the lane. Within minutes, the village midwife had arrived. The examination felt endless. Finally, the elderly woman smiled. "The baby is alive." Eleanor burst into tears. She hadn't realized she had been holding her breath. But the midwife continued firmly. "If you keep lifting furniture, climbing ladders, and working from dawn until night." She paused. "Wobite, you may lose this child." The words struck harder than any insult Eleanor had ever endured. Lose the baby. The very thought shattered her heart. "But if I stop," Eleanor whispered through tears, "this house will never be finished." The room fell silent. Then another voice spoke from the doorway. "It doesn't have to be finished by one pair of hands." Eleanor looked up. Mr. Rowan stood there. Behind him was Clara. Then the shepherd. Then the mason. Then the freckled boy. One by one, more villagers filled the entrance hall until the old manor echoed not with emptiness, but with life. Mr. Rowan removed his cap. "You've been trying to save this house alone." He smiled warmly. "Now let the house return the favor." For the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Manor, Eleanor truly understood something that changed her forever. A home is not built with stone alone. It is built with the hands that choose to lift those stones together. And as grateful tears streamed down her face, she had no way of knowing that the greatest miracle hidden within the manor was still waiting to reveal itself. Behind one forgotten wall, a secret untouched for 3 decades was about to change not only her future, but the destiny of every person who had just chosen to stand beside her. The following morning, the manor no longer felt empty. Before the sun had fully risen above the hills of Blackthorn Hollow, the sound of hammers echoed through the crisp autumn air. Ladders leaned against weathered stone walls. Horses pulled carts loaded with timber. Smoke drifted lazily from the kitchen chimney while laughter reeled. Unrestrained laughter floated across a house that had known only silence for more than 3 decades. Eleanor stood quietly in the doorway, one hand resting beneath her growing belly. Only weeks earlier, she had believed she had been left with nothing. Now she realized something extraordinary. She had been surrounded by people willing to give what money could never buy. Hope. Every villager seemed to arrive carrying a different gift. Mr. Rowan repaired the western roof without asking for payment. Young Tommy, the freckled boy with the gray mule, spent every afternoon gathering fallen branches for firewood. Clara Dawson filled the pantry whenever she baked, always pretending she had made too much bread. Even children wandered through the neglected garden, pulling weeds while inventing games about chasing invisible dragons hiding among the ivy. No one expected reward. No one kept score. Watching them, Eleanor remembered something Nathan had once told her during their first winter together. The richest people aren't always the ones with the fullest purses. They're the ones whose doors never stay closed for long. She finally understood what he meant. Weeks passed. The baby grew stronger. So did Eleanor. Not because life had become easier, because every hardship taught her another way to stand. She learned how to bargain for timber, how to calculate the cost of roof slates, how to negotiate fairly without surrendering kindness. She climbed no ladders now. The midwife had forbidden it. Instead, she sat beneath the old oak tree each afternoon with ledgers spread across her lap, carefully recording every expense in neat handwriting. Mr. Rowan chuckled one day. I've known landlords who couldn't keep accounts half as well. Eleanor smiled. My grandmother used to say that numbers tell the truth long after people forget it. One rainy evening, after the workers had gone home, she wandered alone into the old library. The room had become her favorite place in the manor. Dust no longer covered the shelves. The cracked windows had been repaired. The fireplace burned warmly. Outside, rain tapped gently against the glass. Inside, everything felt peaceful. She slowly dusted the remaining shelves one by one. Each book she lifted carried the scent of old leather and forgotten years. History, poetry, travel journals, scientific observations, lives preserved in ink. She paused before an empty section of shelving. I wonder who you belonged to, she whispered. Her voice disappeared into the quiet room. At that exact moment, a sharp kick fluttered beneath her ribs. She laughed aloud. So you disagree? Another tiny movement answered her. For the first time since discovering her pregnancy, she laughed without sadness following close behind. My little one? She stroked her stomach gently. You already have opinions? That evening, Clara arrived carrying warm stew. The two women sat before the fire while rain whispered outside. After a long silence, Clara finally asked the question everyone else had been too polite to speak aloud. Do you ever hate them? Eleanor looked into the dancing flames. She knew exactly who Clara meant. Nathan's family? The people who had cast her aside. For several moments, she said nothing. Then she answered quietly, I used to. Clara waited. But hatred is heavy. Eleanor rested her hand over her child. And my child deserves a mother whose heart has room for love. Tears filled Clara's eyes. I don't know if I could forgive what they did. I'm not sure forgiveness means pretending they were right. Eleanor smiled sadly. I think. She paused. Tortsint moment for oitos inau mes doortorn han kan fortwef command forsim. Oh howidum. It simply means refusing to let them decide the kind of person I become. The fire crackled softly between them. Neither woman spoke again for a while. Some truths needed silence more than words. Winter arrived early. One icy morning, Mr. Rowan burst through the front door carrying a folded newspaper. His face had gone pale. Eleanor. She looked up from her ledger. What is it? He hesitated. I almost didn't bring this. Her heart tightened. The newspaper had come from Ashcombe. Printed on the front page was a notice of public auction. The Bennett estate. Several parcels of farmland. Sold to settle substantial debts. The grand family that had once mocked her poverty was quietly beginning to collapse beneath the weight of its own pride. Eleanor stared at the page. She expected satisfaction. Instead, she felt only sorrow. Nathan had loved that house. He had played beneath those ancient trees. He had dreamed of raising children there. Now strangers would walk the fields where he once ran as a boy. She folded the newspaper carefully. I'll pray for them. Mr. Rowan looked at her in disbelief. After everything they've done. She nodded. They've already lost more than they realize. What do you mean? They still have their money. For now, they still have their titles. For now. But they've lost compassion. She closed the newspaper. And once a person loses that. She looked toward the window where snow was beginning to fall across the hills. Every house becomes empty. The weeks passed peacefully. Then, one bitter December afternoon, everything changed. Tommy came running breathlessly up the lane. His cheeks were red from the cold. Mrs. Bennet. He could barely catch his breath. There are 2 fine carriages coming from the South Road. Eleanor felt an uneasy chill settle over her. No one in Blackthorn Hollow owned such elegant carriages. She stepped outside. Far across the snowy fields, dark shapes slowly emerged through the falling snow. Black horses, polished coaches, family crests gleaming on the doors. Her heartbeat quickened. She recognized them instantly. The Bennet crest! They had come, but they hadn't come to apologize. They hadn't come to ask about the child. And deep within her heart, Eleanor knew with chilling certainty. They had finally learned there was something far more valuable inside Blackthorn Manor than the crumbling house they had laughed at. And this time, they intended to take it from her. The 2 black carriages came to a stop before the gates of Blackthorn Manor. Snow drifted gently across the frozen ground, covering the footprints left by the villagers who had spent the morning repairing fences. The entire valley seemed to fall silent. Eleanor stepped onto the front porch, wrapping her wool shawl tightly around her shoulders. One hand instinctively rested on her swollen belly, where her child was now only weeks away from entering the world. The front carriage door opened. Mrs. Bennet descended first. She looked older than Eleanor remembered. The elegance she had once worn with effortless pride had been replaced by exhaustion hidden beneath expensive clothes. Behind her came Victoria and Beatrice, no longer dressed in luxurious silks, but in garments that revealed the quiet desperation of a family trying to preserve appearances. For a long moment, no one spoke. Only the wind answered. Finally, Mrs. Bennet broke the silence. "We've come for something that belongs to this family." Her voice remained proud, but it no longer carried the certainty Eleanor had once feared. Eleanor met her gaze calmly. "You gave me this house." "We gave you the building," Victoria interrupted sharply. "But not what was hidden inside it?" Eleanor's heart skipped. "So they knew!" Just 3 days earlier, while Mr. Rowan had been replacing rotten beams in the old library, his hammer had broken through a hollow section of the stone wall. Behind it rested a small iron chest wrapped in faded linen. Inside were journals, property deeds, letters written more than a century before, and enough gold coins to restore not only Blackthorn Manor, but much of the surrounding village. More astonishing still, the journals revealed the true wishes of the manor's original owner. The estate had never been intended to enrich one proud family. It had been established as a refuge, a place whose income was meant to educate orphaned children, shelter widows, and provide honest work for struggling families. Generation after generation, those promises had been forgotten. Until now, Mrs. Bennet stepped closer. "Those documents belong to the Bennet family." Eleanor quietly shook her head. "They belong to the people your family forgot." The words hung in the cold air. Behind Eleanor, the front door opened. Mr. Rowan appeared first. Then Clara. Then Tommy. Soon nearly the entire village stood together on the porch. Not one person spoke. They simply stood beside the woman who had transformed an abandoned ruin into a home once again. Mrs. Bennet looked from one face to another. For the first time in many years, she realized she was completely alone. Not because she lacked family, because she had spent a lifetime pushing love away whenever pride demanded it. Mr. Aldridge stepped from the second carriage carrying the same weathered leather case Eleanor remembered from the reading of Nathan's estate. "I believe," he said quietly. "There is something everyone should hear." He unfolded one final document. His voice trembled slightly as he read. Months before Nathan's death, he had secretly amended his personal testament. If Eleanor should ever discover evidence concerning the original purpose of Blackthorn Manor, she alone would have the legal authority to restore the estate according to its founder's intentions. Nathan had written only one final sentence beneath his signature. "If kindness ever finds its way back into these walls, let no one drive it out again." Tears filled Eleanor's eyes. She could almost hear his voice. Not in grief, but in peace. Mrs. Bennet slowly lowered her head. For the first time since Eleanor had entered the Bennet family. The proud woman seemed unable to hide behind anger. "I failed him," she whispered. No one answered. "I taught my daughters to protect wealth." She looked toward the old manor. "But I never taught them how to protect people." Victoria quietly wiped away tears she had tried so desperately to conceal. Beatrice stared at the snow beneath her boots. Years of pride suddenly felt painfully small. Eleanor walked down the porch steps until only a few feet separated them. The entire village held its breath. Would she demand revenge? Would she humiliate the family that had humiliated her? Instead, she did something no one expected. She reached out her hand. "I'm not offering you the past." Her voice was gentle. "None of us can change that." She smiled through tears. "But if you truly wish to honor Nathan." She paused. "En nästa concert. Heitwan hoshomotsu fortsift. Sofans. Right, help us build what he always believed people deserved." Mrs. Bennet looked at the outstretched hand. Her own hands trembled. Slowly, almost fearfully, she accepted it. Years of bitterness melted into silent tears. Not every wound disappeared that afternoon. Some scars never do. But healing had finally begun. Spring arrived with breathtaking beauty. The abandoned gardens burst into color. Children filled the once empty halls with laughter. The old library became a school where orphaned boys and girls learned to read beneath shelves that had nearly been forgotten forever. The East Wing welcomed widows who had nowhere else to go. The western fields provided work for struggling families throughout the valley. Blackthorn Manor no longer belonged to one name. It belonged to hope. One bright April morning, the cries of a newborn echoed through the manor. After long hours surrounded by Clara, the village midwife, and women who had become sisters rather than neighbors, Eleanor gave birth to a healthy little boy. She named him Daniel Nathan Bennet, not because she wished to preserve the Bennet family's pride, but because she wanted her son to remember the goodness of the father who had loved him before he was ever born. When Eleanor carried Daniel onto the front porch for the first time, nearly the entire village had gathered below. Tommy, now grinning from ear to ear, waved excitedly. Mr. Rowan removed his cap. Even Mrs. Bennet stood quietly among the crowd, holding a basket of hand-sewn baby blankets she had spent weeks making herself. No one applauded. No grand speeches were given. Instead, the church bells rang across Blackthorn Hollow, one gentle note after another, as if the valley itself were celebrating not the birth of one child, but the rebirth of an entire community. Eleanor looked across the faces before her. Months earlier, she had arrived carrying only grief, 12 shillings, an old iron key, and a heart shattered beyond words. Now she held something infinitely more valuable than all the gold hidden behind the library wall. She held a son who would grow up surrounded by compassion. She stood inside a home rebuilt by countless hands. And she had discovered a family that shared no blood, yet loved one another more deeply than many who did. Looking toward the morning sky, Eleanor smiled softly. "Thank you, Nathan." The breeze stirred the blooming roses climbing the old stone walls, carrying their fragrance through the warm spring air. "And somehow, It almost felt as though he was smiling back. Before this story comes to an end, take a moment to ask yourself one question. What if the greatest blessing of your life is hidden inside the pain you're experiencing today? When Eleanor lost her husband, she believed her future had ended. She walked away carrying nothing but a rusted key, a few coins, and the precious life growing beneath her heart. To everyone around her, she looked like a woman who had lost everything. But life had a different plan. The abandoned manor was never the greatest gift she received. The chest of gold hidden behind the library wall was never the true treasure. Her greatest blessing was discovering the strength she never knew she possessed. Every tear she cried taught her compassion. Every hardship built her courage. Every act of kindness she chose instead of bitterness transformed not only her own life, but the lives of countless others. Perhaps today you are carrying your own heavy burden. Maybe you've lost someone you love. Maybe you've been betrayed, rejected, or forced to begin again when you never wanted to. If so, remember this. Your darkest chapter does not have to become your final chapter. Sometimes the road that breaks your heart today is quietly leading you to a future more beautiful than you could ever imagine. Never underestimate what God, hope, and perseverance can accomplish through a heart that refuses to give up. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us, what is one difficult moment in your life that eventually became a blessing in disguise? Your story may give someone else the hope they desperately need today. And if you enjoy inspiring stories about resilience, compassion, faith, and second chances, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another heartfelt journey. Thank you for watching. Until next time, remember, sometimes the greatest treasures in life aren't the ones we find hidden behind walls. They're the strength, faith, and love we discover within ourselves along the way.